Hello, welcome to our webinar on the Concur PO matching functionality that we're going to be rolling out to all of our users. This functionality allows users to submit invoices that are connected to a purchase order or a contract for services and allows you to track balances and activity relating to those purchase orders. It's a pretty straightforward process. Entering an invoice that's connected to a purchase order is basically identical to entering a standard invoice and just provides a little bit of additional information. So we're going to jump right into it. So the first thing I want to note is that I am using a test instance of Concur. So I'm not using any of our actual data, and I'll be using a test project and a test PO. But things are going to look basically the same, and all the functionality will be identical to when you log in yourself. So the first step is to go to the Invoice tab and to create a new request. So from here, if you were going to create a standard request that wasn't linked to a purchase order, you would simply look up your vendor in your most recently used list, or you could search for a vendor name based on what it contains. But in this case, if we want to link an invoice to a purchase order, we want to make sure we search for that purchase order first. So in the purchase order search box, you're going to type in your purchase order or your contract number. So in these cases, it's prefixed by your project code, and then there's a unique identifier after that. In this case, I'm using a test project called PZZZ. So when you type in just your project code, you'll actually see any contracts that have your project code in the prefix. So you should see a list of all of your purchase orders come up without having to type in the entire full purchase order number. So if I search for PZZZ247, I'm going to get my purchase order. But another option is actually to search for your vendor name. So if you know your vendor contains, in this case, test, you'll see a list of all purchase orders relating to a vendor that contains test. So once you've narrowed it down, just make sure the contract number is correct, the amount and the vendor are correct, and then select your purchase order. All right, so you can see that this page looks very familiar. So the payment request tab here has all of the same information as a standard invoice submission. So you've got your vendor information on the left with the address and currency, a pane to enter the invoice header details, which are fields that apply across the entire invoice. And you can use this bar here to go up and down. And below is the itemization summary. So this is the line level details where you'll have generally a tax line and then a line for the remaining expenses. All right, the only difference at this point is that there are additional tabs. So there's a purchase order tab and a matching summary tab, but we won't look at those yet. So to start with, we just want to enter all the information the same as we would for a standard invoice. So we're going to give it a name that's useful for me as a user. So let's just say this is the quarterly billing for test company. The invoice number will be provided by the vendor. And the purchase order number is going to fill it automatically, so we can just leave that alone. The invoice date, so the date on the actual invoice that was given to us. The currencies. The currency is important because not all of our purchase orders are in Canadian dollars. In this example, I'm actually using a US dollar vendor, so you should make sure that the currency of the vendor matches the currency that you're submitting the invoice in. All right, so next you're onto the GST or HST amount. So in this example, I'll say there's $150 of HST, and the total invoice is $650. Just a little one. All right, if you want to add any comments to the AP team or to your approver, you can do so here. Otherwise, we move on to coding. So the subsidiary and your designation or your project will populate. And then you just need to select your program area. So in this case, I'll do general and no award. And then the province territory of purchase. So because I'm using HST, it would be Ontario. The only other new field here is the PO end date. And that's the contract end date that was set up when your contract was put into place. So basically, this is when all of the work should be completed between the start date and the end date. So any work that is being billed should be within September 30th, 2017. So one thing we can note is that my invoice date is actually October 4th. So it took them a few extra days. It might take a month for them to bill you, but as long as the work took place within the contract end date, you're fine. So once you've filled out your header, we'll save, and you'll be prompted to enter the itemizations. So this is going to be consultant fees, and our first line is always the HST. So we're going to enter that HST amount, and this should be the same as the amount that you put in on the header. Add that line, and then the remaining, the fees for, let's say, scoping work, and that's the remaining balance. So if you look up in the top left of your pop-up window, it'll tell you how much is left to be itemized. So I've got $500 left to be itemized. I can add that, and you can see that amount goes down to 0 because I've got my 2 lines, and save. Just expand this a bit. So you can see I've got my 2 lines, one for HST with the HST checkbox marked, $150, which is the same as what I entered in the top section. And then the remaining amount itemized. So you can see here on the right-hand side, amount remaining to be itemized, also 0. Okay, so I've got my header information in, my line level information in. The last piece of a standard invoice submission is to attach an image. So we're going to browse on our computer, attach the PDF or Word document, and close. So if this was a standard invoice, we would be submitting and we'd be done. Not much different to do, but I will bring your attention to these other tabs. So the first tab that we'll look at is the purchase order tab, and this one is pretty great. So this is where you're going to find all of the information about the purchase order that has been created. So it'll have a name, a vendor name, a purchase order number, if there's any specific terms, the total amount, and a start and an end date here. So this is a really short one. It starts September 17th and ends on the 30th, but that's okay. And then on the right-hand side, you've got your itemization, so your lines. So on the purchase order that was created in the system, we have $6,000 coded to consultant fees and $500 for expenses. So these could be, as it says, other reimbursable expenses, such as meetings, parking, etc. So when you're entering an invoice and you're matching or coding it against this purchase order, just keep the coding in mind because this is kind of where it was budgeted, where it was planned to be spent. So you should use the same GL coding in your payment request as what was on the purchase order. So if I came in here and saw that this was contractor fees, I could go back to my payment request, open up my line and change it to contractor fees, because then it would match more appropriately to how the contract was set up. Okay. Another great piece on the purchase order tab is view PO associations. This one's going to be really important for everybody. So again, that's on any invoice that is linked to a purchase order, the purchase order tab, view PO associations. So this will pop up a new window, and it will provide billing details or how many invoices are currently being linked or billed against the PO that you're looking at. So again, we've got the PO total at the top, $6,500, and associated payment requests. So this is the current invoice that I'm entering. So you'll note that all invoices will show up here, not just ones that have been paid. So if you've got multiple people in your project who enter invoices associated with POs, you'll be able to see everybody's submissions. So all the invoices that have been submitted against this purchase order. So that's really great transparency for anyone who is working in a group where multiple people will be billing against this. So if at any time you want to know how much money is left on your purchase order, you can just use like a calculator function. Take your PO total and then subtract the amount of the associated invoices. So I can see right now I've got 56.86 remaining, which is still a lot of money, so no need to panic. But if you notice that you're maybe down to only $1,000, you could say, okay, I know they've got, another 20 hours of work to do, so it's probably not going to be covered by 1,000, and we should go ahead and look at getting a contract amendment. So if you do need a contract amendment, so you want to increase the amount of the contract or extend the end date for the work, just contact your project specialist and they will help arrange that for you. Okay, so we've looked at how much is remaining on the purchase order to make sure we have enough space to bill. We've entered our payment request information. The last tab, you'll notice, has a green check mark, so it's all ready to go. This is the matching summary, and it doesn't provide anything new. It just shows your lines on the payment request and your lines on the purchase order. So there's no action required on this page at all. So basically, you can just ignore this tab. If you're looking for purchase order information, just go straight to this purchase order tab here. If you do click anything on this page, it's possible that your coding on your payment request will get overwritten and blanked out. So it's really important that on the matching summary, no action required, and you can just ignore it. All right, so really the only difference is how we're starting to create that invoice. Before you create it, you just really want to make sure you first look up the purchase order either by number or by vendor. So once this is all ready to go, you'll notice I have a yellow exception. So that's, again, from my header, where the invoice date is past the end date of the purchase order. But again, as long as that work is completed within September and they're billing for September, then it's fine. So this is a yellow flag. It won't stop you from submitting. And we can submit this request. All right, so it went through fine. There are some cases where you may be unable to submit. So if you were to, link a purchase order and then change the vendor has to match the vendor that's on the contract. You need to make sure that the amount that you're billing for is not in excess of the amount of the purchase order. So I was using a $6,500 purchase order. But if I had tried to bill $20,000 against that, you would get a red exception because that's well beyond the amount of the contract remaining. And if that's the case, if you do need to bill above the amount of the contract, again, just talk to your project specialist and they can help you with an amendment. All right, so the next sort of item that you may be thinking is, okay, so I created this invoice, but I forgot to attach it to a purchase order, or I didn't know there was a purchase order. So let's create a purchase order just the standard way. So I came in, I knew my vendor was called test vendor. Okay, I've got invoice for work in September. Like maybe I just received this. They didn't say anything about it being linked to a purchase order, so I'll skip that. This one's actually from September. Span this down again. Okay, let's say this one doesn't have any GST, and the total invoice is $3,000. It's a bit higher. Again, we'll fill out the coding. Let's say this part is programs and a certain award and BC. Okay, same as before, we're going to be prompted to fill out our itemization. I can use that amount remaining. Okay, so I've got the vendor information, I filled out the header, I've added my line levels, but I note I didn't start it from a purchase order, so this field is blank. And you'll see that there's no PO end date and also no additional tabs. Okay, so let's say I submit this request. Oops, I've got an exception. What's that? Oh, I didn't attach an invoice. So standard invoice exception means that you must attach back up, which makes sense. Let's try this again. All right, so now I've submitted this request. If I were to go to my home page, to my payment requests, I can change to ones that I've submitted this month, and I'll see, okay, here's my invoice, not linked to a purchase order. So you can see the green check mark when you're looking at a list view shows that you did in fact link it to a purchase order, or in this case, I didn't. So let's say either you remember that you need to, that you didn't attach a purchase order, but you actually know it's supposed to have one, you can recall the request. So again, that was actions recall, or maybe your approver sends it back to you and says, oh, this should be associated with a purchase order. Either way, it needs to be linked. So you can enter the purchase order number afterwards, but you'll notice if I start typing in my purchase order, PZZZ, there's no search box here. So you actually have to type in the whole purchase order number specifically. So if you can't remember what that is, you can go back to the create new request, look in your, oops, try this way, look in your search box and try this way. So it's PZZZ-247. So even if I put space 247, it wouldn't work. So it has to be the exact typing. And when you hit save, the system goes, oh, do you mean to associate this with an existing purchase order? So I do in fact want to link it to this purchase order, but here it says use purchase order copy down values. You have to uncheck this. If you leave it checked, it's going to overwrite and blank out all of your coding, and you're going to have to do it again. So make sure that you uncheck this. So now I'll hit yes. Okay, so it's updated here, and now you can see we've got our 2 extra tabs, got the purchase order number and the end date. So something that always happens is the program area and award on the header always disappear. It's just a weird system glitch, but we can fix that. So we'll recode that to programs and ABC award, and we'll save. And then do you want to overwrite this on the itemizations? Yes, because it deletes it all the way through. So here, click yes. Okay. So it's a little bit more complicated than when you select the purchase order in advance, because you need to first look up what the purchase order number is so that you can write it in very specifically. Again, if you're missing a dash or a space, the system won't recognize that it's the same purchase order number because this is a unique identifier for the system. Once you put it in, you may lose some of your coding, which you might have to redo. So it's always recommended by us that you create the invoice by searching for the purchase order when you create a new request. Okay, so once you've saved this, you've fixed any coding that got a little bit wacky. If I go to my purchase order tab and look at those associations, you can now see 2 invoices. So the first invoice that we walked through, the 813, and then the invoice we're working on now. And actually noting that it was not 813, this is a Canadian translation, but we can ignore that. In most cases, what would be billing in the same currency, you won't see that issue. But here again, we can look at what's remaining. So if we do 6,500 minus 3752 minus 813, you can see I've only got 1935 left. So make sure you're keeping on top of how much balance is remaining on your contracts, and you'll be able to know in advance if you need any amendments to them, and that can keep the billing and everything moving along a lot more smoothly. Again, matching summary, you can completely ignore this tab. It's got a green check mark, which means you're good to go, and we can submit. So now we've entered 2 invoices against this test purchase order. One we did from the create new request search, so from the actual purchase order itself. The other one was, you accidentally created it without attaching a purchase order, so you can do that retroactively, but it is more complicated and it does require a little bit of rework when you have to recode the header information. Purchase ordered invoices will go to your approver, the same as always. If you are an invoice approver, you can still submit a purchase order linked invoice and then self-approve. I'm going to pop over to the production instance of Concur just to show you where some of our help and training materials can be found. So if you go to help and training in the top section, this is where you can find, if we expand this out, some videos, so our introductory full training videos for invoice. The PO matching walkthrough that we're doing today is linked here for you. But I'd say one of the best places is the Tides Canada Concur FAQ. So if we open this up, again, I've got links to the training videos at the top, and then a lot of questions around usability, taxes, invoices. You can search to find what you're looking for, and if we scroll down to the bottom, we've got a new section on PO matching for you. So what kind of error messages to expect, a step-by-step walkthrough of how to enter an invoice when searching for a purchase order, how to find out the balance remaining, etc. So a lot of good documentation in here for you guys. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate you taking the time and your interest, and we hope that this PO functionality works really well for you. Thank you so much.